Welcome to the Double Loop Podcast. While you're working on your comparisons, we'll talk about comparisons. I am not Eric Ray.
And I'm not Glenn Langenberg.
Welcome. Hey, Eric, we are getting together to try to do some comparisons for viewers. We talk about doing this quite a bit, but never get around to doing it. But you've done a little prep for us in prepping some images that we have had a chance to analyze, and we're going to get a chance to compare, is my understanding. Is that what we have for the viewers today?
Yeah. So far, I've given you the latents, but not the knowns. Well, I just gave you the knowns before we started here, but you haven't actually done the comparison step yet. You've just done your analysis.
Correct.
I've gone through the whole ACE portion of my examination, and so we'll look at a couple latents, focus on one in particular, and kind of watch in real time as you go through the comparison phase.
Yep.
So
that sounds good. So it'll be like I'll be doing the cooking, and then you get to pull everything out of the oven.
and I already did the kind of the test batch, last week, or tested the recipe before, something along those lines.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Well, so a little backstory here about these comparisons. These came out of a case. I was asked to take a look at some latent prints. I didn't get any context of what case these were from or what other previous conclusions were, and walked through my analysis. Thought these are suitable for comparison, and then I identified one and then was inconclusive on the other. And so I'll talk more about how I got to take another look at that inconclusive conclusion. Eventually saw kind of a different orientation and ended up reaching an identification. And so Glenn already knows this part of the story. So, but I think stepping through this comparison will be real interesting for examiners.
All right, that sounds good.
So first off, let me switch over to the images that I got. So here is, this is labeled L2. So this is the second one I had, where I initially, when I did my comparison, said inconclusive. And then there was the other one. Let's take a quick look. This is the other latent. And I know you did the analysis on this one here.
Yeah, I haven't seen that known yet.
You haven't seen the known. But
yeah, that latent was ridiculously good.
The quality of the image could be a little bit better, but I mean, overall, this is not a difficult identification to make, and you can see I have quite a few features before I kind of like, all right, that's enough.
Right.
This wasn't really a challenging latent. But we're not going to go into depth on this one because it's not as interesting to talk about. But I wanted to at least show you the known print from this one. At least have you do a quick spot check. Note any major differences from what your analysis came up with. So, do you see anything striking or interesting to comment on?
No, not at all. This is really boring because it's way too easy. Although, if this was an actual case, I'd be quite happy getting latents like this. Other than like you said, the low resolution. By my estimates, it was looking like it was around 300 ppi. I don't even think it was hitting 500, but
yeah, it was a little chunky. But luckily it came through okay. I think it may have been processed through PDF. Maybe I don't know exactly, but still good enough to work with, if not perfect from an image quality perspective.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so this is the original image that I got for the one that we're actually going to be focusing on here today. So let me turn on all of my analysis minutia.
And I'm not going to look at yours right now. I'm just going to focus on mine for a moment.
In my kind of initial pass, I saw this as the kind of upright orientation. I didn't necessarily see anything wrong with that. I don't have a core. I have kind of a hint of where the core might be. I don't really have a delta, just kind of a hint as to where it might be right down here. But enough minutia in between to say, it's suitable for comparison. Moving on to the next step. Now, when I went through and you went through a second pass at this, I also requested the original images. So let me first show you the original image, the lift that this came off of. So here's that latent there at the bottom. I'm sure you wouldn't be surprised to see that this is labeled as having come from a magazine, from a firearm.
Yeah, okay.
That makes sense to you, right?
Yeah, the circles.
The circles, yep.
Yeah.
Let's see. I did my own enhancement, and then this is what I sent to you.
You just hit that enhance button on your computer, right? The one that they have in the movies.
I got some little tricks. Photoshop can work some wonders on things, but it does take some practice. So but this is a lot easier for me to see than the original from what I got. So I in general was able to pull out a few more minutia here in my analysis. I basically just started from scratch once I got to this image. And this is what I gave to you. So let's switch over to your screen, and you can talk through your analysis.
Okay. So I did not put all of my features in different layers, so I can't go through my green and then my yellow, then my red. So I'm just going to throw them all on. And it was as soon as I started doing my dots, I realized, the resolution is pretty low on this because I usually use a dot size of 16 pixels when I have a 1200 DPI image or PPI image. So it just seemed like it was way too big. I dropped it down to about 11 or so, and it even still seemed a little too big. So my dots are a little big, but I think the viewer can probably see them.
Sure.
The area I really liked was right in here. I think you can see me circling it with my mouse, yes. So there were a number of these, including, I'm going to flash on and off, this little short ridge that popped up in the middle here.
Yep.
So that little short ridge. And then a series of ridge endings in here to what looked like either sort of opposed ends or an ending ridge and a bifurcation with a nice gap in the middle and a pinch coming from the top and below. Really nice target group in that area. I completely agree with you, like the orientation. You can't see the exact core, but you can feel the core here. You can feel the delta down here. I mean, you can just see how the ridges are flowing. I get a pretty decent sense of this ridge count from where I'm estimating the core to the delta to there. And then I'm not expecting a lot of these features to be present on an exemplar way up in this, 1 o'clock zone of the tip from what I see here. Distortion-wise, there are things that stand out, from the level 1 detail. The ridge flow has this deformation waviness to it, very typical in twisting. It's that iconic waviness that you get in a good twist. Then you also have expanded areas between the ridges and compressed areas between the ridges. Expansion compression is a sign of movement of the skin, which is, again, consistent with the idea of twisting. So it seems like there's definite twisting here. I'd be on the lookout for that. And possibly what we call deformation or compression of the pattern in some way. And obviously there's a lot of background noise. There's not great contrast in certain areas, but a pretty decent area of minutia. I mean, I didn't even count, but I obviously have more than 16 minutia here. Other than the distortion, I would probably label this a relatively non-complex latent print. I obviously would like a higher resolution image, but for the amount of minutia and the amount of clarity there, nothing really stands out to me. I would probably consider this high specificity and non-complex because of the large number of minutia. I would also run this through the ULW to get a sense of a score, and we could do this at the end. But I'd predict that this would be in the 40s for this, given the surface area and the amount.
And
certainly
that's the
30s.
And that's the
Yeah.
LQM clarity score you're talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah, exactly. Which for fingers, about the highest I've ever seen on a finger is up to 60. Theoretically, the score can go up to 99, but I only get into the 80s and 90s with palms.
Sure.
So a 30 for a finger is pretty good. I would imagine the score would be at least a 30 on this.
Yeah, so for distortion wise, there seems to be an area kind of right in the middle of your grouping of green.
Here.
And there and slightly to the right of there, that's like kind of the clearest. And before you get to the smudgy part, that's really the less clear. But right in there, like that's kind of the crispest area.
Yeah, I agree.
And then kind of above and to the right, you get the expansion. Below and to the left, you get the compression, suggesting that the movement is towards the expansion. That's kind of how expansion and compression works. So where the pressure is being applied kind of up and to the right in general for the, if not movement, then at least pressure in the lateral pressure in that direction.
Yeah, I would agree with you in that because that is exactly those signs. Usually when I see twisting, I don't usually try to put directionality on it, but no, 100% seems like it would usually be moving from the bottom to the top when you have compression on the bottom and expansion on the top.
And let's see, a couple other questions here for you for the analysis. If you could turn on the minutia again, maybe give me like a magenta or a blue color. If you can just give me your rough estimate guess. If you could put like a dot on it, where is the core, or the top recurve, if this is a whirl, and then where is the delta? How about there? Okay.
Yeah.
I think roughly that's about where I would have estimated both as well. And partially, if you take off the colors here for a second, you've got the ridges flowing down towards the core, I think, is pretty obvious, but the ridges flowing down towards the delta.
Mm-hmm.
If you take off the colors, you can see they kind of start to separate a bit. And then underneath, you've got that 90-degree, kind of got like a little ridge in the mush that is going perpendicular to all the ridges above it. It's really kind of selling right there.
Are we talking about right here?
Yep.
Yeah.
I think that's what really sells the delta placement of being right there.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, so then one other thing I want to ask about, and if you go to your leftmost red minutia, and then you go to the right, you go to the right one, and then a one more to the right.
Yeah,
those two right there. That second one, kind of left of it, is a little bit of like a. If you maybe zoom in a little bit, we can see it a little better. But there's I don't know. It looks like it may continue on further than where you have it marked.
Sure.
And I wanted to kind of get your comments on that.
Yeah, so very true. A lot of times when I see what looks to be maybe the ending ridge and then a gap and that little chunk, that island that's right off the coast, so to speak, I usually tend to put the dot on the thicker part of the ridge because that could be an incipient, but I will certainly allow for that because, again, in my thinking of gyro is more about that there is a feature here as opposed to the exact position of the feature. Completely agree with you. It could be here. Frankly, it could be as far as here if it actually connects to that ridge.
Sure.
So anywhere in here, as long as there is a feature somewhere in this area. But that's what generally lowers the specificity of a feature is when you don't know the exact position of it.
Right. All right. So Glenn, go ahead and bring up side by side, and let's start on the comparison. Oh, so sorry. Last thing, I think we're both in agreement. Suitable for comparison. Right?
Absolutely. Okay. And I would probably even categorize this since I go a little bit further for value for identification.
Sure. Right.
I would absolutely be able to expect not only to identify it, but because of general core and delta position, I would also expect to be able to exclude it.
Right. And that's where we're a little different. Without the clear core, the exact precise location, clear delta, I wouldn't go into the exclusion realm, but but again, agree on the suitability in general terms and for identification.
So just to, if listeners are interested, on that point, for example, if the delta wasn't there, I mean, like I couldn't see far enough to that delta, would I still consider this for exclusionary purposes? Probably.
Okay.
Because I feel pretty good about the position of that core going into this. The delta helps, that again, having a sense of that, because again, I feel like I can get a sense of the ridge count. So going into this, even though you're 100% right, you cannot distinctly see both, not for traditional Henry, I get a sense of both. So that's why I would have this in that exclusion category. But I just thought, playing the what if game, if we didn't have that delta,
sure,
would I feel as comfortable calling this for exclusionary purposes? Probably.
Well, I mean, essentially, you should be able to go to pick up, really any known print, find the core, go straight right of the core, see those two kind of stacked bifurcations, and the short ridge just past it.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, all right, we've got our known now side by side. I mean, first glance, ridge flow looks, at least in the same ballpark, without the obviously the distortion. The rolled print has a different type of distortion, but there's not anything immediate where it's like, oh, this is an arch. We're completely in the wrong, with the wrong finger. So go ahead and take it from here and start marking up the similarities from your analysis.
Yeah, and just for listeners, I know we've said in other episodes, but if you haven't seen it, just mention it. You've mentioned it before. By bringing open the swatches toolbar here, you can very quickly switch your colors here, and then if you push the X button, you can swap between your colors. So just the X in Photoshop allows you to swap those two palettes here, and then very quickly you can change to a red or whatever color. Just a cool little quick tip if you're not aware of that. You told me about that, Eric. I wasn't aware of it, so I'm on board with that one.
And if you have a version of Photoshop from this century,
I do not. I literally do not. Mine is from 1998.
Then I've got some actions, and that's how my dots end up in different layers, and because then I can move them around and keep a better documentation of which ones I move, which ones I delete, etc. That's, if you want all those, just contact me and I can get you that. And there's also some videos on my YouTube page, kind of explaining how all that works.
Yeah, I'll even show the listeners, watchers. I don't even have a rotation tool. Like if I have to rotate something, I have 90 degrees or arbitrary. That, I tell you, that is the thing I hate the most about not having a modern Photoshop, is I don't have a rotational tool. It drives me insane.
All right. So what's your target group going to be here? Beginning comparisons, pick a target group. What you going to pick?
Well, my first thing that I noticed is I don't like the ridge count. The ridge count actually feels off.
Yeah.
And my target group, which I feel pretty good about, is this selection of characteristics here. This is my primary target group, this little short ridge. I love the little short ridge. And then these 3 or 4 or 5 features here. My secondary target group would be this configuration over here. I'm a student of Pat Wertheim. You've been through the Pat Wertheim process. So I usually like to have 2 target groups, if not a third one, ready to go too. My third one would probably be down here, but I just love these characteristics throughout out there. It's a really nice high specificity configuration.
Sure. Yeah, the short ridge, you got the back and forth up at the top. Good variety, different areas to look for target groups.
Yep. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The 8 to 10, is going to put me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 10 right in here. And I don't see this target group. I don't see it there at all. So then normally I start adjusting my tolerance going up and down. And at this point, and this is exactly what happened, when I saw this image, I went, oh, wait, there's a little short ridge here, but no, that's way off because that would correspond. This here, I'm going to mark this short ridge. It should be right about here in this area. but my eye is going to get drawn to my short ridge here. And then my eye is going to get drawn to the ending ridge and the long gap between it. And now suddenly I'm on high alert. I'm like, well, okay, if that's there, then that. And then I start looking through this. And then as I go from here and follow this ridge up to there, follow that ridge up to there, then this puts them in a sequence of 3 through here on the analysis side. Well, that one, it's a lot farther south than I would have guessed. I mean, given this position here,
Right.
that should be way down here. And that one is kind of in my target range. So all of a sudden now I have this target group, and I will tell you I'm on high alert because at this point I'm like, all right, it is not where I would expect it to be. But if this is an APHIS search, and this is the top candidate coming up, this is a wonderful close non-match. And
So, yeah.
my target group is all there, but in the wrong position. So I could see what APHIS might be looking at. So now I have to start going okay. I immediately go, I'm on very thin ice. So I need to be very careful about any differences I observe because these little things aren't quite jogging, and I don't like where my target group is. And then I have to kind of remind myself, yeah, there was twist, but I don't like the core delta ridge count. So I've got some things that are making me think it's not this person, and I don't know any background if it's an APHIS search or not. But then I've got correspondence and a really nice target group. So that's my mental state at this point before I get to the next all-important part.
Let's see. Having that short ridge as your target group, that's really kind of what you're focusing on. And then seeing a short ridge where it kind of jumps out at you.
Yeah.
I think is really helpful there. And really, that short ridge in the gnome print also stands out where you can see it fairly easily as you kind of scan around. Okay, well, if my short ridge isn't there straight to the right, well, where is any short ridge? Oh, well, there's one.
Well, that's not even how I would even think about it, because it's not that I'm looking for any short ridge. I happen to see a short ridge.
Oh, okay.
To your point, where I thought you were going is, if this was a little bit like, if there was some smudginess there, I'm not sure I would get back on the hook for noticing the recognition. In other words, the only thing that saves me is I happen to think very strongly that there's a short ridge here, and then I just happen to see one here. But I will tell you, if this was smudged, I would be leaning a lot stronger towards exclusion right away.
And I mean, even so, I mean, that also relies on you seeing the short ridge to begin with in the latent, because it's not.
That's my point. I got lucky with the short ridge, so to speak, or not.
I could also see another examiner not marking that short ridge. It's not in the best area of the print.
I'll take my dots off. So, I mean,
there's something there, especially at the top. The bottom part is less clear, but the top is. I gotta say, I saw it too, but I could see another examiner not being confident enough to mark it, at least not in green.
Or if I was tired, I would have marked it yet. Well, no, you just said.
Yeah.
I'm surprised I marked it green.
Okay.
To be honest, I really am. My instinct could have gone easily yellow on that too, but it just seems so clear along with those other ones. For example, like the feature next to it, I feel pretty good about. But these all, to me, kind of ring about the same.
So, the when I first looked at this latent a few months ago with the other version, the other less clear version of the latent print, my initial target group was the 2 green points that you have marked. The top one we had talked about as to where the position is a little unclear, where where it might be an incipient as it trails off, and then the one right underneath it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
So having those 2 minutia right on top of each other, kind of at 1:30 on the clock face up from the core.
Yeah.
And where and I had it marked with the top minutia extending out to the left further.
Ah, okay.
Taking basically the incipient part as the ending of that.
Yeah, okay.
So I start looking around for that as my first target group. and there's nothing there that really qualifies. Right?
Yep. No, you're right. I mean, yeah, you'd have to. Yeah, it would be weird if that corresponds to this. You'd be looking for it over here.
And it's so on your gnome print right now. It's the what that actually would correspond to is that one and the one down to the left of it.
Yeah, exactly.
And what I was looking for was two minutia where they're basically on top of each other, with the top one maybe going further to the left. So those just don't qualify at all.
Yeah.
Even counting the incipient that you see in the known.
Yeah. Yeah, this one is pretty far to the left, and that it just rings really on the edge of tolerance.
Right. So we're going to come back to that minutia at the end. I want to talk quite a bit more about that one, but now let's go ahead and continue through with the rest of your comparison, expanding out from this target group set.
So my instincts would then be to start moving upwards, just because I had a better target group up here. When I say better, I mean more specificity. Mm-hmm. So moving up from here, I would go 1, 2, and look for an ending ridge. So again, my instinct would be the 1, 2. I'd look for it in this area here, but it is over here, which reminds me that this one was pulled over. So I'm seeing some of these features being twisted or pulled, probably in the latent where I recognize some twist, but I'm recognizing, all right, interesting. And if that is there, then I'd expect another one just above it. And I go up 1, 2, well, there is one coming in right around there. And then if I jump over to look for that bifurcation across the gap, again, it's a little bit farther than I would have expected, but there is clearly one there. It's high specificity. And now we get back into this twist again, where I'd be looking for another feature just beyond it. There is one. And I'd be looking for another green up here. And there is one. So I'm feeling pretty good about all of those. They're just, if this is correspondence, it is twisted the hell out of position. And it is really, really, really just jacked up. I mean, it's just not where I'm expecting it at all.
Well, but they are all moving, moved in the same direction, kind of the same distance, right? So it's almost as if you just need to rotate the whole thing counterclockwise, I don't know, 45 degrees or so.
Which I could do with my arbitrary rotation tool. All right. And then I think there might be something up above this, but I can't quite tell. If it is, maybe it's up higher. But my known, I mean, it doesn't look like it. I mean, if that ridge goes through, then it would have to be right around here. But I'm not, my known cuts off. So I can't verify with this yellow. So that one's out. And then I've got this other red down here that I expect just off the base of that. And if I count over 1, 2... well, it's not exactly where I'd expect it, but there is something there. I'm going to mark it, but it's a little bit farther than I would have guessed, but there is something. Maybe I mismarked the position. Maybe it should have been here.
I think that's good, because if you don't count directly to the one next to it, but if you look at the green one up towards the top, and you follow its bottom leg runs into that red, and then you're known. The bottom leg runs into the red.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just positionally, spatially. Spatially, it's not where I'm expecting everything. And in fact, another question I would want to know is, let me get a ruler on this. I want to make sure that they're the same size, because these spatial differences are bothering me. And there aren't many rulers in these images. So that's just another little side thing when you have spatial differences. Make sure they're at least to the same scale. All right, so then going back this way, so from here, from this last one down here, where are we? So that would be that one. Then I'm thinking that there's going to be a feature down here. Now, I don't see that other than here, but now I'm off, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
If I'm following this here, That's really pushing it if I mismarked it. I expect something there, but I'm not quite seeing this. Was I off a ridge? Well, there is something here. I'll come back to that later if it matters, but I don't like that. It should have been here based on where I would have
Sure.
assessed it. But it is red, so forgivable. Let's drop back down from these features from my short ridge, and I got those. And then let's get to see if this yellow is here. So let's see. Where are we? There.
Start from the bifurcation just to the left of the short ridge. I think that's the best one to build off of, that one.
Yeah. So there is a ridge ending right here. And if I jump over, then there's a green and a green. And I will tell you at this point, I'm liking things, but I'm still worried. But
Right.
I am liking things. I mean, if I jump over 2 more ridges, 1, 2, it's there, but again, it's twisted way the hell, or I've mismarked it or something.
And we're starting to get into the area in the latent, what we can tell was very compressed.
Yep.
And that's definitely affecting the distances between the ridges, but the ridge
For
count
sure.
is still still accurate and is what we expect.
Yeah, and then this would be off by a ridge if that red is that red and spatially. So I'm not convinced that red is that one because there's just this extra 1 or 2 ridges in
Sure.
here. So I don't know. It should have been
I
here.
think that's there instead, yeah.
Yeah, right. So I'm looking at this now going, oh, let's see. So is that now, is that? I mean, if you look at the ridge down,
Yeah.
maybe that should have been that. So maybe that red was wrong and it should have been as an orange. Now I'd mark it as an orange. Putting my reds aside because they really do factor very little. I have
Sure.
a lot of correspondence. Oh, I have a few more green too, don't I?
2 more down at the bottom, yep.
To bang out here. So let's see.
So go back to the one under the short ridge. There you go.
Yeah, so here, and I gotta trace that down. How many? 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
I'd look higher up.
Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4.
There you go.
Yeah, I see. And then 1, 2, 3, possibly one more. I don't know. I wouldn't mark anything in there. Yeah. Well, I will tell you that if I was to run this in the model, I don't know that the model's going to like this.
Really?
Yeah, it's so distorted. It's going to drop everything. Anything I get for specificity, this distortion is crazy, and I'm not convinced of the size that they're same scale.
So let me switch over and share my screen here,
Yep.
and because I've also I've done my comparison already, but I've also rotated everything so that basically up is up for both of them. So here for my analysis, and you can see I think I marked a couple more than you did. I definitely had more of a distribution between the different colors,
Yes,
including
for
the short ridge there being red for me. But I mean, overall, I would say that by and large, most of these are we've marked the same things in both prints. I think
Yeah,
you
I
had
agree.
one that I didn't mark here. I had a couple more like here and here.
You have that
And-
yellow one close to the core.
And here, yep.
Yep.
And then you had, I think, one more up here. I want to say, but other than that, it's just kind of the normal distribution where the differences are at the edges where things are the least clear. But in the main body of the print, we overlap pretty well. Looking at it now, I don't know. I seem to do this where I kind of question, why did I mark that one red? That seems at least a yellow to me, or why wasn't the short ridge at least a yellow? But still, this is my initial analysis.
Yeah, I count about 3 or 4 more that you have.
Sure.
But my distribution skewed heavily green.
Yeah. So then here is the side by side that I have. with this known print rotated about 40, 50 degrees counterclockwise.
Mm-hmm.
And so from a, kind of which way is up, this is now kind of up and even kind of straight up from the core. And that kind of matches now here with the gnome print. And the short ridge coming up at about 1, 2 o'clock, being the same here, and the same minutia coming out here to the side. The difference being the compression of the ridges through this area, different than in the gnome print, again, which is left in a different manner. But the ridge counts also work. The number of ridges in between are all still consistent. And I don't know, I think the model would be okay with this. And it might just...
You know why I can't run it through the model, right?
Why is that?
Because we don't have a scale in it.
I believe that there is a scale. Oh, so here's what I did for the scale. This is from a lift card, right? So I assumed the width of the lift card and measured across here where it appears to be flattest against the surface, and then used that as a rough equivalent of a scale. So I might still be off by a little bit. And then the gnome prints were done, I believe, on a copier, turning from a copier into a digital file. So those should be accurate.
Okay.
But there still may be some differences there. I think most of the differences in the distances would be from the compression, but from the compression of the ridges. But I think down here at the bottom especially is where it really starts to stretch out, where it's just smushed up here, pushing these ridges a lot closer together.
Yeah.
I tend to say a lot in training classes, ridges can get further away from each other, like these set, when the ridges in between expand like an accordion, but they can't get closer together along the length of the ridge.
Right.
Well, maybe they can a bit. I think I sometimes overstate that because, especially with some extreme distortion, these do seem to have pushed up a lot closer in this compressed area. But maybe that's the key, is looking for that evidence of compression.
Yeah, and to be fair, they can compress along the ridge, just not as drastic. And I think it's probably going to be also, this is something that, if I remember correctly, Lisa Dinning's research project out of Australia showed that it can be pattern dependent. That whorls can suffer more of those sort of effects because the ridges are often perpendicular to any pressure movement because it's a whorl, right? Whereas if you have an arch pattern, depending on the direction that you're applying the force, if it's not perpendicular to the ridges don't necessarily compress or expand the same way. So this could be one of those kinds of effects where you might get it, just maybe not as drastically.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about these guys.
Yeah.
So I we can kind of see this ridge end about here. I've moved it. So let me show you the moved ridges. You can see in these colors here represent the ones that I had to move slightly from my original analysis location to its final location. You can see kind of the shadow in the background of how far each of these moved. Relatively minor for each. The kind of movement you would expect from connective ambiguity. But here, we've got, let's call this an ending. Let's call these 3 endings with 2 ridges and then 1 ridge in between. Everything else makes a lot more sense to me, except for the location of this guy right here. It doesn't quite fit in as well with everything else. this at least appears at first to be this kind of incipient guy right here in the latent, which would roughly, be kind of like this incipient guy, but that can't be because then this ending's just right underneath it, and it's way further to the left.
Yeah.
So this minutia here is the one that gave me the most heartache, and I also think led me astray during my initial examination when I initially said inconclusive for this one, because these two were my target group that I couldn't find. So, and again, I looked for other target groups as well, but just in the wrong place because I had assumed the orientation to be like you had originally had it.
Yeah, exactly.
So what are your thoughts here on is this more of the compression that we're seeing in this area? Is there some sort of fault line through here where we, like some of the stuff out here you can't really rely on, so because it's just so bad. What's your explanation for this apparent slight difference?
Well, it is a difference. I don't know that it's a deal breaker difference
with everything else. Sure, exactly.
With everything else, and I think because there are stretching and distances that I'm picking up on when I was doing the comparison.
Within tolerance?
Yeah, I'd say on the very edge of tolerance. I agree with you. I mean, looking at those two, it seems much farther in the known. But it's not the only distance issue. Mm-hmm. There were other distances that seem stretched, and yeah, it is stretched along the ridge. But man, I mean, given that extreme waviness and everything else, it would have me on edge, but not a deal breaker per se.
Yeah, I think it might become a deal breaker if, say, we lost half these minutia.
Sure.
But with just this much, it's pretty overwhelming. Not just in the fact of number, but also the specificity. These are some pretty good back and forths and short ridges and a good area represented of the print, where that enough to put me into identification territory.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at under your red short ridge, I mean, look at the distance between the green and the yellow, right? No, not those two. Along that same ridge.
Yeah, that's a lot closer.
Yeah, and then look at the next green and yellow as well. I mean, all of those just have a little bit of distance. The green and yellow just below. Follow the green along that ridge to the left. Yep. So green and yellow, and then drop down exactly 2 ridges, that yellow, to the next green, to the right.
Yep.
So, I mean, again, they all look off a little bit. And then go up now, directly up to that yellow, and look at that yellow to the right and that green. No, and now go to the right to that green, yeah. And look in the known, again, like everything is just off a little. But...
And just to be clear for anyone who's not an expert watching this, everything...
Why? Why would you do this to yourself?
the everything off a little, I think we should kind of explain that a little bit. It's not off in the sense of like off from prints that are from different sources. The off is in the distance more so.
The expected spatial difference.
Right. But that can change. Fingerprints are flexible enough that you expect these distances to change as pressure is applied from different angles. The thing that can't change, that shouldn't change, is the number of intervening ridges between. So between this red short ridge and this green bifurcation, there's 2 ridges in between, and then over here there's 2 ridges in between. No matter how much you stretch or pull those apart, those ridges remain in between. And that is consistent throughout. As you go through and count those ridges in between every pair, that's all consistent. But after doing it for a while, you expect to see, certain limits as to how far the skin can stretch. And this one is starting to kind of
Agreed.
push up against that limit of what we'd expect. And part of the problem is also this ambiguity as to exactly where this yellow one ends.
Yeah.
Again, I had it marked initially a little bit further to the left, and but it could easily be even further to the left, or back up where I have it now out to the right. Okay, delta. So you had initially marked out, and I had also assumed the same, delta right around here.
Yep, we appear to be wrong.
In this kind of region. And because we've got some ridges going apparently in separate directions, some divergence, and then this underneath it, well, that's the three directions to form a delta. And I think it's clear now in hindsight that it's just some distortion, and that this cross piece here isn't real. It's made up of, you can actually kind of see some ridges flowing through here, and there's some highlights that all kind of line up to make it look like a continuous ridge going this way.
It's tricksy, as Gollum would say.
It is very tricksy. This, combined with the kind of dip in the ridge flow here, and the presence of the core, which I think is, more or less accurate-ish, it really does give that impression of that original orientation that we had it, as opposed to this one here. This is not the obvious orientation.
Agreed. Yep. And again, could easily see without some of the target groups or lower confidence in those target groups, easy to erroneously exclude this.
Exactly. Or to erroneously inconclusive, or so.
Oh, I don't know. I
maybe
don't
not
know how I feel about that.
So let me. That's true. So let's back up for a second. Let me go back to the original image that I got in my analysis of it. So again, here's that original. See, I saved you because I didn't give you this one. I gave you.
That one's garbage.
But note, in my initial analysis, a couple things. No short ridge, right? And these points marked up here with the top one further to the left, instead of over here where we eventually both ended up having it marked.
Yeah.
I mean, you can, and then combined with the apparent location of a delta down here to give this kind of look of, I'm looking just straight to the right of the core. You can see where my mind was at, why I was comparing it in this direction, why I didn't find any correspondence, and then why my conclusion initially was inconclusive. But hey, if you got better versions of these images, I'd like to see the better images.
Yeah, agreed.
So maybe that is an appropriate conclusion of saying,
yeah, for sure,
inconclusive, but I want to see better.
Yeah, that's fair. And in the spirit of full disclosure here, if I could, I thought I would run this through the ULW software. So again, big fan of this. So you just bring open the latent. It has to be 1,000 PPI. So I have upscaled it to 1,000 from where it is. But if you're telling me it's 1-to-1, or basically
roughly 1-to-1
ish. Yeah, then this will be adequate enough. And then I just go into here, detail quality metrics, and ultimately it scores a 30 for this.
So
and
you're
that was my guess, right? Right around 30.
Yeah.
So ultimately it shows, if you're not familiar with this, it shows a high quality region, which just sort of catches the edge of, like you said, the top part of that short ridge, maybe not the bottom so much. Shows where a lot of, technically where my green features were, but you varied in your assessments, yellows on the outer area. But I mean, it gives it a pretty decent surface area and a pretty decent score. But that's what I would have guessed for this, given the volume of ridges and features. So usually I find that if it scores a 30, they tend to be identifiable impressions. 20s are more marginal, but if you get a 30 or a 40 for for a latent fingerprint tends to be identifiable.
And again, to be clear, this is the clarity score, not the
Clarity score.
LQM,
Yeah.
the actual latent quality
So
metric.
great point.
What's
Yeah.
that score?
That is a 51.
51.
Which is okay for a finger.
Right. Yeah. Definitely seen higher, but that makes sense for this one here.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So again, here's the latent that I originally got, and then also now I want to show you the known that I originally got. So in this here, the short ridge again is a little more difficult to see. It's kind of just a lump in between these other ridges, and just overall, down in here starts to get really fudgy as well, and overall just not a great recording or image of this known print.
It looks like what you get when you get a PDF discovery.
Pretty much, just really the importance, showing the importance of higher quality images to be used for this work.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that you and I, as independent experts, run into all the time. That when the latent print unit discloses their exemplars, they throw them all in a PDF because they think it's going to an attorney, and they don't know that an outside expert has been hired. Whereas we have to go back and then say, no, we need image files.
Right.
Because when you get this, again, if listeners don't realize, you're used to working with, for known exemplars, 500 PPI, and for latents, 1,000 PPI or higher. But a PDF is around 72 PPI. So you are losing a ton of information. If you're lucky, you're at 150.
Yeah, well, I mean, so PDFs can be set to really any resolution, depending on what you load into them. By default, it can often be that low. But even if it is loaded into a PDF as a higher resolution, it still undergoes compression. That's not ideal.
Exactly. And it's very frustrating as an expert because we're not looking at the same materials that the original experts are looking at.
Yeah, I'm just kind of noticing now this circle looks a little ovally. I wonder if there's something else happened to the image as well, where it got smushed.
Talking about extra distortion.
Because it's not doesn't look perfectly round, right? It's a little off from round versus what we've been looking at mainly this whole time.
Interesting. Almost like when you take letterbox and put it into a 4:3. Yeah.
So I don't know what's going on there, but that looks off.
Interesting. Yeah, you're right. There is it doesn't quite. You're right. It doesn't quite feel right. It feels like there's extra distortion happening there.
I want to then kind of talk a little bit about why I went back and re-examined this, and why after re-examining it like this, and then seeing the correspondence that was there, asking for another better set of images from at least as original as I could get, and a new set of known prints. You notice that this isn't the same known print. That I have a completely brand new set of knowns that I gave you. We used for that comparison. So, like I said, when I was first asked to take a look at this, I didn't know any details of the case. I really knew nothing about it. They were just these images. The only information I had was in the images. I heard about a podcast that he was talking about fingerprints, went to a web page where someone had done a whole breakdown of a fingerprint comparison, and was like, wait a minute, I know those latents. I recognize those images. So I dug up my files, found it, and what I saw on the web page was, again, very detailed notes and documentation of what that examiner did. But I noticed a couple things that was like, well, I don't know, that's kind of an assumption there, which made me then go back and relook at my documentation, saw I had made the same assumption, and then took another whole second look. So I thought we could kind of talk through this documentation as kind of the final portion of our video here, and just kind of, point out where this examiner went wrong as really as a training tool for other examiners as to how to avoid erroneous exclusions. All right, so first off, some just basics of ridge detail and minutia and feature, levels of detail. Just the basics of fingerprint comparison. Details of endings and bifurcations. Just some basics on general fingerprint topics.
Which, by the way, you and I have said elsewhere, I'm not exactly sure. We're not fans of categorizing a ridge ending or a bifurcation because there isn't really ground truth, and under different pressure conditions or other distortions, a characteristic could be a ridge ending or a bifurcation. In fact, they can be both depending on the pressure conditions. So we're not real fans of doubling down and saying this is that or that. We recognize it is a ridge event.
Right. I mean, and you can talk about how it can appear different in different impressions, because this is an impression of the structure from the finger onto a surface. Mm-hmm. So someone might say, well, then let's just go look at the finger, right? That's the actual true source. Then that should be able to tell.
That's the only ground truth. Yes. Well, not necessarily the recording.
But even then, right? Say you've got this bifurcation, but one of the arms of the bifurcation dips down maybe a third of the depth of the full-on furrow.
Exactly.
Like this is a complex three-dimensional structure, so what's the ground truth then? So sometimes even the skin itself can't answer that question as in a binary way, ending or bifurcation.
No, you just said it, in a binary way, because it's conditional. Right. Under high pressure, it is a bifurcation. Under low pressure, it is a ridge ending, and based on the actual source skin.
And that can even change with damage to the skin itself.
Age.
Exactly. Like this one here looks like damage that breaks up a normal bifurcation to look like an ending this time.
Yeah. So I mean that's my issue here is it says ground truth directory using effectively inked impressions, but inked impressions are not ground truth, and it is a conditional issue.
Sure.
And I think that has traditionally been taught. Well, the exemplars are ground truth. No, it's the source skin, and moreover, there isn't necessarily ground truth. It could be both, depending on the condition.
Right. All right. So here is where we're finally getting into the image itself. So here's our latent, and this is the same kind of version that I saw initially. And here he's traced out the general ridge flow. And marked out location of a core and delta. So the ridge flow, later on he does a better tracing job. This is just real general ridge flow. But I don't think it quite captures the waviness that we were talking about here in this area. Right. But the big thing is the delta, right? He's got it marked in the same place we had it marked, where we had initially presumed it to be during analysis. Again, not surprising, like we talked about, there's some smudges and some distortion down here that give the appearance of ridges running perpendicular to these, but they're not true ridges. They're not actually, truly there, and that leads to this assumption of its location, which then can, building off from there, goes into assumption as to the orientation. That this is upright, and then sets the examiner up to continue those assumptions through the rest of the analysis and comparison. So here is again now the tracing. So I did a tracing of this as well. I didn't show it earlier. I wouldn't necessarily, except for how much trouble we had with this, I wouldn't normally do a tracing on this latent. Usually I save that for things that are slightly more difficult. But this one is kind of tricksy in that it looks easy to begin with. It's just you don't realize that there's a couple assumptions that are happening that are making it difficult. It appears to be non-complex during analysis, but I forgot to ask you this, Glenn. After comparison, would you label that as a complex examination as a whole?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I would have demoted it into old Swigfast Zone B simply because of the distortion
Sure.
and the tolerance that we talked about. Yeah. The number of features is great, and the clarity of the features is great. The distortion makes it complex, and the rotational issues make it complex.
Right. So here he's marked out endings and bifurcations using different colors. And
if only he used green, yellow, and red.
it's a different mindset here where, like you're saying, he's locking in on what the type is of the feature, as opposed to our markings were different quality levels or confidence in the location of something happening there and not necessarily the type.
Yeah, this is very old school. This is, again, traditional training that you see with examiners. You'd see this a lot with the FBI, where they would effectively double down in their charts on if it's an ending ridge. They do little, what are those called, cutouts, where you highlight something and zoom in on it. What is that called?
Oh, like a little bubble chart?
Bubble chart, right. Exactly. You kind of zoom in and show ridge ending, bifurcation, dot. You name it, some minutia. It's very common in in 70s and 80s for charting purposes.
And so here he's got this marked out, and then now labeling the minutia of his target group. I do want to commend his documentation, right? So I think
it's fantastic.
The key thing here is, again, it's documented differently than what we typically do, but it is documentation, right? And it is to a much greater extent than what you would normally see from a lot of examiners. And what this really allows us to do is dissect exactly at what point did things was there an assumption made that led to an incorrect conclusion.
Yeah, in the classes I teach, you probably say similar things. I talk about the value of documentation, and I always come back to, why do we document? Why is it so important? So another examiner can understand how you reached your conclusion. It's not about showing the right or wrong conclusion. It's not even about, I agree with you or I don't. It's so you can understand how another human being reached their decision. This documentation is fantastic. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind how this examiner reached their conclusion. This documentation, to me, is a 10 out of 10 because it absolutely accomplishes what you want it to accomplish.
Right, absolutely. Some close-ups of the minutia, and now finally side by side with the latent and the known print. Core and delta now being marked with basically highlighting the same thing that you had noted initially during your comparison, that it appears that the ridge count, the number of ridges in between the core and delta, is completely different.
Yeah, agreed.
And this, again, highlights that really well. And so he actually counts it out, 15 versus 20.
I'd almost say it looks like he's done type lines. Again, traditional, right? Traditional type of approach. But yeah, that looks like it's the...
Yeah, it's true. But I would say he wouldn't make such a big deal about it if the difference was like 19 versus 20.
Agreed.
But it's 15 versus 20. This stands out as being a pretty significant difference. And really focusing on, okay, here is the starting group, the starting target group. Note again that he doesn't have the short ridge marked out either. And the target group being these three up here at the top, not a bad choice. It's away from some of the compression.
That's my second go-to.
Exactly. You had highlighted those as your second one. And without seeing the short ridge, well, there you go.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And really clearly spelling it out, ridge counts in between these three. And then here, I think, is where is really the major assumption that really puts this examiner down the wrong path for the rest of this examination. It's saying, okay, this is the area where my target group is, so this is the area where I need to look for that target group in the known print.
And the examiner would be right 98.5% of the time.
Yeah. And efficient, right? In looking
Yes.
and saying, okay, this is where I need to look, and look, there it is.
Yes.
But obviously, the target group that he's looking for isn't here. It's basically because it's slightly off the edge of the crop from this image, but it's just up here. He's just looking off by a few millimeters, really. All right, so then he has the style side by side. The images marked out, saying, okay, here is the minutia, and I've already marked out from analysis in the latent print. Here's the minutia I see in the gnome print, and clearly these are not the same. They're not in the same place. There are differences between these two sets of minutia.
Yes, instinctually, that was exactly my feeling as well. What he is showing on screen is exactly my reaction when I saw this.
And again, it makes sense, but it's built on an assumption that is because there was overconfidence in the location of the core and delta, and then overconfidence on the orientation, and overconfidence in limiting the search area to this right here versus a broader search of, let's say 10, 12, 15 ridges out from the core in any direction instead of just up and to the right.
Yep. I've made that mistake multiple times in my career, by the way.
And that's the thing, is that this isn't an uncommon mistake. This is the most common mistake in fingerprint comparisons of looking in the wrong place, seeing differences, and you're like, okay, well, there's differences, so it must be an exclusion. Where it's like, well, no, really, the differences are just because you were looking in the wrong place.
Or orientation. I find I'm when I make those erroneous exclusions, it's an orientation issue.
And that's sometimes because of distortion, or it's really that the smudge on the edge of the print that kind of looks like a delta or kind of looks like a core, and that messes examiners up all the time because once you see it as the core, as a delta, then that's how you see it. You really, it's almost impossible to see it any other way. You have to really be thinking of, okay, is this the core? Is this the delta? Or am I making an assumption? Am I seeing distortion as this shape?
Yeah, I call that inspiration. If you don't have that inspiration, you can't teach it, right? If you don't have that inspiration, you simply won't see it. You have to have that moment of inspiration. And I can think of several cases where I just never occurred to me that I had it rotated wrong. And it worked perfectly for the previous 99 cases.
Right. So here he kind of, just to highlight the difference, shows the other latent print in the case, or the other one that's documented here on this page, where he walks through, okay, here is the ridge count between all of these corresponding features. That all works out perfectly. And again, here you see the core, right? You see the whole core of the whirl, the top recurve, the bottom recurve, and it's pretty clear from, there's no distortion around the edges. You have a clean outer shape. So the orientation and location isn't in question. I start here, that corresponds to here. This way is generally up, this way is generally up, and then you can go from there. All right, so I think this is really the key lesson for latent print examiners to take away is, recognizing when you have the core or when it's just off the edge, to have this limited area of tolerance as to where to look for your target group versus when to have to expand your tolerance and look across a larger area.
Yeah, and honestly, I didn't do that. I mean, that's the thing. I can tell you, my comparison, I only got lucky because I happened to have that short ridge and happened to notice it, right?
Right.
Like you said, had it been smudged in my known exemplar, I would not have noticed it because I was not expanding my tolerance beyond such a wide area. And so, again, I can really understand how that happens. This documentation, as we said earlier, it's so fantastic. I can really understand. And if you happen to have the right target group, the right things that pop out to you, you get kind of lucky right away. Or if you are, like you said, if you're willing to really expand and rotate and forget all of your assumptions, fantastic. But I admit that it's really hard for me once I sort of zone in on it. And it's got to be this area here. I don't know that I would have thought to have gone that far had I not noticed that one very distinctive characteristic.
And let's highlight that here. Here's that short ridge. So it's very difficult to see here in this version of the image. Here it is in the gnome print. I mean, it looks like every other little smudge across.
Agreed. Agreed.
Across the print. That just disappears, right? And that's one of the things I highlight in how if you have a feature or a pair of features facing opposite directions, it's easy for those to disappear. And here's an example of that happening versus just a standalone bifurcation. You go from one ridge to two.
Great
point. Can't really hide that. It just you gain a whole ridge. Here you gain and lose it, so it disappears.
Yeah, great. That's a really good point. Yeah, very, very astute.
And then here, the two, minutia. Again, this is one that we had it by the end, had it marked here as the ending. It does kind of look like it continues all the way up to here in this version of the image. And now this is the pair you're looking for with the top ending either right above or just extending further to the left. And that corresponds to
I could point. Yeah, right there.
Yep.
Up there. Yeah, right there.
That corresponds to these two right here, where you can see how much further back. They're not on top of each other. This top one is much further to the right.
Yeah, I mentioned when I went through my analysis how I tend to mark, even if I see that. I mean, I would consider that the dot could be the ending ridge, but I do tend to mark shorter. But I just make a mental note that it could be anywhere in there for exactly that kind of reason, that you just never know if it's like an archipelago or something where you might get several dots coming off the end. And yes, maybe the ridge is at the final island, or maybe it's back in the mainland. But
right,
you will run into that from time to time.
All right. Well, Glenn, great talking through this here with you. And I hope that we can share this example with more examiners, in the future. And again, I think the documentation of this is so important for training going down the road. We've got documentation of bad IDs, right? Erroneous IDs. There are examples of that error occurring. And the documentation that led the examiner to that erroneous conclusion. The Mayfield print in particular. The FBI documented up that print so you can see why they reached the incorrect conclusion that they did. We don't really have those kinds of examples for erroneous exclusions. So having this documentation of an incorrect exclusion, will be a great teaching resource, I think, for examiners going forward, to reduce the risk that other examiners across the field that they would make that same mistake. And that's just so critical. We've talked about this over the past year of how learning from errors is key to our field, and is so valuable to our field. Instead of sweeping them under the rug or just not talking about them, or only discussing them within the agency, having those shared across the field will only increase the capability and reduce the risk of other examiners making that same mistake. Yeah,
and 100% there. It's just because this may be an erroneous conclusion, or maybe let me say it another way, I don't agree with this examiner's ultimate conclusion. It's the documentation that is so insightful, and the documentation is fantastic here. It is exactly what you want to understand how an examiner reached their conclusion, whether or not you agree with that conclusion or not.
Exactly. And I hope that we can find a way to better document exclusions going forward, so this isn't such a rare case, that we really can, have this be a normal process where documentation occurs for every conclusion, so that when disagreements occur, examiners can really, like you were saying, understand why the other examiner made that different conclusion.
Black mirror eye implants.
All right, I'll get to work on it, Glenn. I'll get to work on it. So, I hope this was an interesting comparison to walk through. There's a couple other latents in this case that are less interesting. There's the whirl with all the minutia. There's a couple other smaller prints that with fewer minutia, but those also line up. They're not as complex or interesting as this comparison is, and so kind of skipping over those. But I'm glad we kind of had the time to sit down and walk through this one, Glenn. I'm glad that we came across this sample, because I really think it's a very interesting comparison. And there's definitely some interesting lessons that latent print examiners can take away from this sample, where certain elements of the distortion, of the image quality, of the fake delta, could lead examiners towards an erroneous exclusion. And by being aware of these things and how to compensate, they may be able to avoid that error.
100%. Yeah, this has great elements. It's very easy to see how an erroneous exclusion could come forward or rise to the top, depending on your target groups. If you don't allow for it, I got kind of lucky with my markings, to be honest. On a bad day, I might not have given that short ridge as much weight or green color, and it's the short ridge that saves me, because frankly I'm looking in the wrong spot and I don't like the ridge counts. And if this is an APHIS search, like one of many candidates in an APHIS list, I'm probably going to miss this one. So I think it's really good, and I really like that we're able to look at it from these different perspectives. It's so distorted that twist has such a huge impact on things with this. But I find this to be a real challenge, even though we haven't said this, but I assume your opinion here is ultimately there's extremely strong support for same source, and one could identify this based on the present characteristics.
I do. I think I'd said the word earlier, but I don't think we really emphasize it enough. Yeah, I do think that there is extremely strong support for that proposition, and the conclusion I now have for this comparison, well, not this one, but the the one with the better this one is identification.
Yeah.
So
another thing here, Eric, is case APHIS would not miss this one, given the number of minutia.
Yep.
If this is search in a closed search or a case APHIS environment, it's not going to miss this one. It is going to absolutely find those minutia, because they're clear enough in the latent and unknown that even an autoencode, I suspect, will pick up on these. This is a human assumption issue about the orientation and ridge count.
When you mention APHIS, it made me think of something else here, and it's that the rotation, right? So when you search an APHIS, especially like for NGI or most APHIS systems, you can either search it as upright, where it gives the tolerance of rotating the latent 30 degrees left or right, so that 60-degree window. Or you can have it run 360, where it'll just rotate the latent to any possible direction, and then bring back a result of it in any orientation. So even if you enter it in upside down, it'll still find the match. And from my measurements, the kind of to get these two to align is roughly 40 to 50 degrees counterclockwise, which is outside of that range. So if you're searching this in APHIS or case APHIS, and you have it with the upright, if you're confident, you think you're confident that that the upright orientation, how it was originally presented like this, is correct, then APHIS might actually not find it, which then underlies the importance of of doing that 360 search.
Always. Always. I would much rather have fewer candidates or fewer shots at candidates and run something 360 than to rely on that 30 degrees. Because if you're just off by a simple 90 degrees, which you and I have seen enough erroneous exclusions, and we know 90 degrees is a commonly it's a common error is to have it rotated incorrectly 90 degrees. And you're going to miss it. And I've got examples of that, as I'm sure you do. So yeah, that 360 is so important. You got to have an accurate 360 APHIS.
So again, even here, taking off the dots, you can see the short ridge kind of disappearing in here, and also kind of, geez, I even lost it, disappearing in here.
Yeah. Yep. But all those other ones are going to be picked up by an APHIS system. So again, point being, a human is more likely to miss this than technology.
Yep. All right, Glenn, thank you guys so much. And, we're going to be making an effort to do more of these videos, throughout the year, time willing. And
it's another New Year's resolution.
Another New Year's resolution. And also, with needing more samples, right? If you have a particularly interesting sample that you're allowed to share that we can talk through, I would definitely appreciate any of those images that you can share. All right, so if you do have anything like that for us, send us emails, glenn@eliteforensicservices.com or eric@rayforensics.com. And then anything we say here is reflective of our own opinions and not necessarily anyone that we work for. So with that, thank you guys for watching.
Bye, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this little comparison time.